Hello and welcome to this DCD talk on navigating data center pre-development. I'm Emma Strutton, I'm Head of Channels at DCD, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Will Ringer, who is the Pre-Development Director at SLS Consultants. So thanks very much for joining me today, Will. How are you?
Oh, very good. Thanks, thanks, Emma.
No, thank you very much for joining. So, to start off with, are you able to tell me a bit more about you, your career journey so far, and how it led you to be Pre-Development Director at SLS Consultants?
Yeah, thanks, Emma. Yeah, so I'm an architect in training. Spent more than 13 years now in the mission critical data center sector, and about 22 years in total in architecture. So much of my career really was actually working for global design practices. So I actually worked for two of the top three, leading their mission critical groups and EMEA groups. And then more recently, I was working in Asia as well for a large UK practice, and I was leading their sector out there also. And then moved back to the UK. I've been working on projects really across EMEA and across APAC and across the US also, including jobs in California, Texas, and East Coast of the US. So I've kind of been quite lucky, really. But really, so before that, I was actually working on very very different sort of projects. So actually in 2009, 2012, I was actually working on really high-end sort of hotels, large malls, and publicly focused buildings. So obviously those building types are much more focused on the visual impact of a building, less about functionality, but functionality is always key. But I'd say the mission critical sector is great because it is very very functional. It's all about functionality, so you've got to make sure that these buildings work, and that's what really keeps me sort of interested. Yeah, and over that time, I've been sort of involved really in from the inception of projects from concept or even early concept through to the actual operation piece, and then actually working with clients actually on what went wrong in that previous project. So I've been really really lucky there. But I worked with SLS as a client of mine, so I had a long sort of standing relationship with them, and yeah, and that's where the opportunity came up. It was almost at the my real passion at the moment really is in the early stage of project. So you want to get a project right from day number one, and actually understand what are the key sort of site risks, what's the best way of setting a building out, and what do these technology clients want. So that's really been my key driver there.
Brilliant, thank you, and a good global perspective there. Moving on slightly, I suppose bringing us back to looking at data center pre-development sort of through, as you said, through the very beginning stages of the project. I suppose when developers first start exploring a new data center project, I suppose what are the key factors that determine whether a market is worth pursuing?
Yeah, I think there's sort of lots of different sort of. I mean, there's a lot of noise in the sector, and when I sort of say noise, I mean that if someone's got a piece of land that's within 3 to 10 miles of a substation, they're saying that they've got a data center, and that's not always really the case. And this is a key challenge. Is I get sort of calls from clients saying we've got a piece of land, we've got planning, we've got power as well, and then you'll ask them on the initial conversation. So really, before you even put a fee into them, saying, well, this is a scope of works, this is what we'd like to do for you. You're sort of saying to them, actually, what is the agreement in place? What have you got in place? Because occasionally they'll misunderstand what they've actually done themselves because they're not sort of within the sector. They've probably been ill-advised by someone else that actually having a gas application or actually having a power application on the site is the key thing, but actually program's a key thing there as well. So if they haven't got program, if they haven't got time, and the site's in the wrong place, so again, location, that's always a key thing there. So actually understanding that is key because obviously the latency between a number of other data centers. So you can't just go and build a data center in the middle of a field, in the middle of nowhere. You've got to really sort of think about, is it within a destination? If it's of a certain scale, is it creating a destination? So let's say you've got Slough Estates. That's now sort of very much like a UK destination. And you've got Didcot as well. That's a destination. So it's actually understanding where there's a critical mass of data centers, to then build your building near it. So it's going to be the same in the German market, especially in Frankfurt. So same in the Dutch market. It's the same fundamental factor really everywhere, that you've got to be within a destination location.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I suppose when we talk around sites in the industry at the moment, obviously the biggest factor is power availability. But as you've just touched on, factors such as fiber connectivity, land constraints, and of course workforce can also affect whether a site is worth pursuing.
Yeah, that's a great question. Obviously, fibre is a really important element, but not the fibre requirement, because fibre is always going to be required. The technology is changing there. So obviously, you've now got AI. I do hate the word AI because it's just a different technology deployment in my field. So that's my understanding anyway. It is understanding actually, is it for hyperscale? Is it for AI type of deployment? What sort of deployment actually is it? But then you then look at the European sort of market. So um, it it typically sort of starts with if we sort of look back at an individual site as an example, it's taking a high level feasibility assessment of a site, which is generally like a fairly quick exercise. So as an example, I looked at a site recently in North Carolina. It was a great location. The client had found the right bit of land, but the client hadn't been to see the sort of land piece, and but hadn't realised that there's a nearly 15-meter gradient across the site. The site was only about six to 8 acres in size, so it was quite small. But actually, the viability of that land then was less. So then it doesn't become necessarily like a red flag, but you're sort of saying to a client, "Are you aware of this situation on the site?" And the impact of that is, if you're looking to build quickly, well, you're not going to be building very quickly. It just means the process gets elongated. The land value might be less, but again, you just don't know these things. So it's really taking a bit of a judgment call on these things, where you're not trying to sort of say this site's completely a no-no, but again, it is sort of location is always like a key thing. Supply chain then becomes a key thing as well. So if you're in the flat D markets, finding supply chain should be easier, but there's so much demand at the moment that that's becoming a problem. If you're in tier 2 and tier 3 markets, then the supply chain's a different problem because you haven't got the supply chain there. So you've then got to take people to those sites. You've then got to get the skill service to actually build the building and then fit out the IT as well. So there's a whole different range of challenges which start becoming sort of real issues.
Yeah, yeah, and you touched there on primary versus secondary markets and kind of the different consideration factors there. But how are developers evaluating emerging or secondary markets compared to these established hubs, as you said, like FLAP-D in Europe?
Yeah, if you look at the FLAP-D market, actually the FLAP-D market really stems from really banking. It was all the city banks sort of building their own data centers. So you look at central London, you've got all the data centers along Docklands. They were basically built in that location so that the guys at Canary Wharf could actually see where their data was. It was more about proximity and vision. They wanted to make sure that their data centers were that they could actually see the buildings and make sure that there was actually nothing going wrong. And that's more of their own lens of what they expected. If you went back to like 1970s, 80s, and yeah, more like the 80s and 90s actually, the data centers might have been within the buildings. Then they became sort of much larger buildings that were completely separate from the banking buildings themselves. Now what's happening is you've got AI, you've got different deployments. You've got deployments which are focusing more on people using technology. So let's say I'm using Word on my computer, or if I'm using other technologies at work, it's deployed in a different way. So the technology vendors are now chasing after the customer, and the customers are elsewhere. So they're not now purely focusing on the FLAP-D markets. They might be looking at other tertiary markets. So you, you look at Madrid, Milan, and other places also where actually there's a great opportunity there, and also there's power as well. So that then becomes the opportunity. It is chasing after those opportunities where the FLAP-D markets are becoming constrained. There's not as much power on the grid, so you're looking at other alternatives, and the planning might be easier in those places because there's less knowledge around the sector. And again, the sector is, if you went back to 2012, it wasn't very visible. And now in the last couple of years, it's become very, very visible because the amount of money that's now being invested into the sector, it's getting towards trillions of dollars now. So that's the key change is the perception of what we're doing, we have to be much more careful and a lot more mindful about these sites to make sure the site actually is it in the right place. So let's say if it's within like a greenfield site, is it in the right area? So there's lots of different demands now to really be aware of to make our clients' lives easier.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that keeps coming up again and again in construction is, of course, sort of speed to market and that demand. So how can this be balanced with site optimization as well?
Yeah, speed to market's an interesting point. So obviously you've got a very good sort of supply chain in those flat D markets, where you then move into markets that aren't as that don't have the supply chain there. Perhaps the methodology the way that you build a building changes. So let's say in a flat D market, you would have expect that the offsite manufacturing is an expected sort of thing within those marketplaces, especially with environmental requirements. So you're trying to make as much off-site to actually sort of reduce the amount of waste on site. You're trying to improve the quality of the building. Actually, in those tier 2 and tier 3 markets where actually the supply chain might not be there, but actually the demand's there as well. It's coming up with a methodology that actually stops you having to sort of fly people in from the UK, from Ireland, from Germany into those other markets. So that then it improves the environmental standard of the site. So you're not flying all these people in. You're actually using a lot more of a local sort of trades as well. And things are being built off-site. They're being commissioned off-site, and then the final commission is being done on-site. So actually, you're reducing those man hours on sites, and we're now seeing a lot of that, especially in the Nordics and more in the Middle East as well, where actually the supply chain is not there. So actually, if you're building things off site, it's just an easier way of doing things. I think there's challenges around there. Obviously, if you're building a volumetric building that would have been smaller, it's now a lot larger. Moving those things around is just a different challenge. But truthfully, in architecture anyway, and in engineering, it's been happening in other sectors. So it's just using other sector knowledge to actually make these things more workable. So I think it's not that it's not been done before. It's just it hasn't been done in our sector before a lot of the time.
Yeah, interesting point. And with the the rise of AI workloads and hyperscale demand that we're seeing, how has this changed the way that developers approach that early stage planning and capacity forecasting as well?
Yeah, so obviously my past life as an architect, sort of working on large scale master plans, really all over sort of Europe and the Middle East and in the US. It was almost sort of strategizing, looking at sites and seeing how much power you can get to a site. Because obviously the idea that AI workloads were starting to happen probably 2.5 years ago now. I was looking at test bits on sites in the US market where there were 1.2, 1.3, even 2 gigawatts of capacity on the site. And at the time, the client's going, well, this is probably too much capacity. We probably don't want that much. But they'd have the conversation with the grid connections, and suddenly, actually, about 3, 4, 5 months later, they were going, actually, I wish we had requested that 1.3 gigawatts on the site. So it's almost you had some clients which had a bit more forecast, especially the hyperscalers. They kind of know what they want, but then working closely with a lot of those developers, there are very, very close relationships within those firms, and they'll say, we've got a demand that, say, in London, we want like an extra 800 megawatts in the next 2 years. It's just based on demand forecasting. And the AI workloads kind of works hand in hand with the cloud as well. So they kind of both need each other. It's not you can just have one on its own. Yeah, the whole industry is changing, and everything's rapidly changing. So I think it's not just our industry; it's going to be other things as well. So it's a great time to be part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. And what are the most common due diligence issues that can derail a project after a site looks initially promising?
Yeah, I guess I've got a few working examples I can probably use. So I looked at a site recently in Eastern Europe, and the landowner said, "Yeah, we've got planning on the site, we've got power on the site." The client got the site under offer, and then we pulled the team together to then have the kickoff meeting. On day number 1, we realised actually the site didn't have planning and the site didn't have power. So that can definitely derail a project fairly quickly. Also, I'd say clients that don't really have the foresight in the way that you work with the local authorities, it's a really, really important thing. You've got to be aware that the sector is now very, very visible, so everyone knows about it. They know the amount of money that it's generating. And honestly, I think local authorities kind of know that now across the European market, especially. So you've got to be mindful that you're trying to help them approve a project. And the less information you give them, or the less clear clarity on what you're trying to drive as a designer or as an end user, then the more problematic it then becomes. So you're trying to sort of add value as well. So you're not just trying to build a building in the middle of nowhere, or trying to build like a data center within an urban context. You've got to think about what is the impact of the urban context, and actually what simple things can you do to actually make the local context better as well. So you're always trying to add value, and let a client know as well on like a RAG list. So let's say you've got an item which is the site might have some contamination from the past, but it's within proximity of a local urban area. Actually providing the site's now gone from like a contaminated site to a non-contaminated site, providing a small park on the edge of the site to actually make it more urbanly linked adds a lot of value, but actually to the client end user, it doesn't really cost them anything. So as long as you're still gaining the yield of the site, and making the site making sure that the site is actually financially viable, and you're coming up with a strategy that hopefully gets through the planning process, that is really the most important thing. So it's a strategizing really ahead of the point. So once you're in like the Reba stage 1 stage, where you still haven't really got to a planning application, but you're sort of stating back to a client, you might have to do this, this, and this, and it might take 2 years to get there. It's just being clear on timelines as well. That's definitely another key thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned there kind of the challenges around power, which of course are all over all over the industry at the moment. But at what point should developers begin those discussions with utilities, and what information do they typically require before committing to capacity? And I suppose how are developers kind of structuring those partnerships to secure long-term capacity?
Yes, it's actually SLS, so we actually partner up with an HV consultant, and really that's the most important thing, especially in the European market. Actually, any market really is actually having a consultancy that understands where power might be available. If it's not available, they know who to speak to. So really having those key relationships with the energy markets, and knowing what questions to ask is actually a really, really important piece there. Because if you don't know the questions to ask, you don't know the right people to ask the questions of. If you're working in the UK market with National Grid, or if you're working with other stakeholders, you're working in the French market or even German market, it's all the same sort of thing in reality. It's coming up with a strategy for that developer, that might be what is the first tranche of power for day number 1, and then what is a load ramp that makes any sense, because at the end of the day, like, you might want like a gigawatt site, but you're not going to get a gigawatt day number 1. It's going to take 4, 5, 6 years to get there. But when is that power going to be available? And strategizing a clear, coherent route as well. It is really what that business will actually need from their own side, because obviously they've got their own internal investment, that will actually invest in the projects. If the program timeline is too long, it might not get investment until later in the process. So actually coming up with a strategy that might get things moving quicker, it is generally what we try to do with our clients.
Yeah, makes sense. And I suppose to finish us off, you mentioned there about kind of the general public becoming kind of more aware of what data centers are doing. So how early, I suppose, should developers be engaging with local authorities and community stakeholders?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Emma. I think it's always obviously the power piece is the first piece to make sure a site's actually viable, first. So that kind of gets done in the background. Once you've got an understanding of is there any energy available for a site, then it's then moving into the next steps. And the next steps is having those conversations with the stakeholders. So actually sort of speaking with the local authority, if it's in the UK, doing more of a pre-application. This is the essence of the design projects, and taking the stakeholders on that journey. Because at the end of the day, you've got to understand what are the challenges, what do they want, is the data center development in that location actually going to be a viable thing? Because occasionally a stakeholder group might say, actually, no, there's no chance you can build a data center there. So then you know fairly quickly, actually, why would I invest money in that? So actually, and that's probably at a sort of state where you're actually going to get an idea of it, if there's power on the site. You're then investing a lot of money into that power application as well. So it then changes from thousands of pounds to hundreds of thousands of pounds. So that's really when the investors start really investing. So there's a two-prong approach there. Really, is it's understanding is there power, but then does the local authority actually want that project there? So they're the key things really from my perspective that can derail the project, and engaging with the stakeholders. Yeah, definitely a thing that we need to do more closely. And in the London market, definitely it's been a very, very close engagement with local stakeholders. In other areas where they probably don't have the local planning officers sort of knowledge around the sector, is probably where it becomes more problematic. Because at the end of the day, if you're in a local council in the UK that hasn't got any data centers, trying to explain to them what it actually is and what value it brings can be a bit of a challenge. So you've got to retake them on that journey and identify what the value add actually is.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Will, unfortunately, I have to wrap it up there because we are out of time. But thanks very much for joining me on this DCD talk, and we'll look forward to kind of hearing more about what you and the team at SLS Consultants are up to. But thanks so much for joining me today.
No, thank you, Emma. It's been great.